can you, just explain how the rating system works and what the different percentages mean?
Sure. It helps if you know the theory that underlies the VA rating system. The intention behind the rating system when it was set up back in the 1940s was to provide a replacement for loss of earning capacity. So if, for example, you're rated at 50%, the theory is that the benefits you get at the 50% level represent a replacement of your lost ability to earn if you're 50% disabled. And the numbers, of course, don't necessarily match any particular person's loss of earning capacity. They're relatively arbitrary.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Hey there, welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran who is applying for disability benefits with the VA, subscribe to our podcast for the latest developments in VA disability. So welcome, I'm Francis Jackson, this is Christian Terrison. We're from Jackson and MacNichol, a law firm that specializes in helping veterans get the justice they deserve by getting the benefits they're entitled to from the VA. So what's this all about? Well, today we're going to talk about the questions people have about the VA rating schedule. And who is this show for? Well, obviously it's for our veterans, but it's broader than that. It's for those who are related to veterans, who are supporting veterans, who care about veterans, folks who want to see veterans get what they are entitled to. That's why we're here.
All right. Well, as you said, this episode is about the ins and outs of the VA rating system. It's a perennial topic for a lot of our clients because all you have to do is Google VA math to see how much of a mystery and how much of a headache the rating system can be. So I guess to start with, can you, just explain how the rating system works and what the different percentages mean?
Sure. It helps if you know the theory that underlies the VA rating system. The intention behind the rating system when it was set up back in the 1940s was to provide a replacement for loss of earning capacity. So if, for example, you're rated at 50%, the theory is that the benefits you get at the 50% level represent a replacement of your lost ability to earn if you're 50% disabled. And the numbers, of course, don't necessarily match any particular person's loss of earning capacity. They're relatively arbitrary, but that's the theory that it's all based on. And so what makes it very confusing in application is that, say you have 10% ratings, 10% for tinnitus and 10% for hearing loss and 10% for one knee and 10% for the injured thumb on your left hand and 10% for your right shoulder. In ordinary math, those 10% would all add up to 50%. But in the VA's rating system, they don't. And the reason for that is that the VA percentages are not simply additive because they're intended, as I said, to compensate for loss of earning capacity. And the way that's structured is the VA takes the largest percent rating that you have. Say, for example, you are rated at 50% for one condition. When they go back to rate the next condition, say at 10%, it's 10% of the remaining 50%, not 10% out of 100. So it's 5% in actual, the way they do the math in the combined rating table. And the next 10% is 10% of the remaining 45%. So it's only 4.5%. So you get these results that seem incomprehensible to people just looking at it and saying, but wait a minute, I've got this percent and this percent and this percent, and they should add up to 90%, and the VA is saying I'm only at 70%. I don't understand. Well, it's because the subsequent percentages are only a percentage of the remainder and not of the whole 100%. So that's the basic place you have to start. Now, within that, the VA rates in 10% segments. So they do the math, and if your math comes out to say 33%, then they rate you at 30%. If it comes out to 37%, then they rate you at 40%. They go to the nearest 10%. And each 10% is defined in the rating tables and set at an arbitrary amount of money each month. So if you're at 10%, it's less than $200 a month. If you're at 100%, it's over $3,000 a month. So there's an arbitrary amount pegged to each particular level of rating, whether it's 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, et cetera. And that's kind of the overview of how it works.
Gotcha. And so who is responsible for determining a veteran's disability rating? And what are, I guess, the criteria that are used in arriving at that rating?
Sure. The criteria are found in 38 CFR 4.25, which is the VA's rating table. It goes on for pages and pages and pages. And the goal that the VA had in constructing this rating table is to look at all the common physical conditions that veterans may have, particularly the ones that are likely to result from serving the military, and to assign a set of rating percentages. And so, for example, with the back, a basic back strain be 10%, severe be 20%. If there's damage to the underlying spine, it might be as high as 40%. So each condition has its own rating table, or if it doesn't have a specific rating, then the VA does what they call rating by analogy, meaning they try to figure out what the condition that's in the rating table is that is closest to the condition that the veteran has, and they rate it based on that condition. And so sometimes in cases you'll find that there's a fight over what the appropriate rating code is, which one is actually the one that's closest to the particular symptoms that this veteran has. But that's where the ratings come from. And then the rating code sheets, tables, show the particular symptoms for each level of severity within the rating code. So like for a mental health condition, for example, if the person is pretty severely impaired and not able to do typical work-related activities or maintain relationships with others very well, they're likely to be rated at the 70% level. If a person is really very severely impaired mentally, then the rating can be as much as 100% for that condition alone. And for the heart, for example, you can have very low ratings or as high as 60% for a severe heart condition. So it depends on the particular condition, and you simply look to the rating codes to try to determine what the closest diagnostic code is, and then what best approximates the symptoms that this particular veteran has.
And in the first instance, who is making that determination?
In every instance, well, almost every instance, that determination will be made by an adjudicative person in the regional office where the claim is being handled. Used to be these were all handled at the veterans local office, but now they have what they call a national work queue, and the claim could be assigned to a rater anywhere in the country. But in almost every case, the rating decision will be made by a rating specialist in a regional office. I say almost every because in some instances, a judge at the Board of Veterans Appeals will actually set the rating percentage for a particular condition, but that's much less common. Typically, it will be in the rating. There'll be a rater in the regional office.
Gotcha. And so where do, I guess, medical examinations, C&P, or compensation and pension examinations come into play in arriving at these rating percentages?
Medical opinions come into play in two ways. The most common way they come into play is, as you mentioned, a compensation and pension exam. That's a situation where the VA is required, if someone has a condition that appears to be connected to service, to then obtain a medical opinion regarding that condition as to, number one, is it connected to service? And number two, if so, what is the rating, the appropriate rating? And the VA has promulgated a series of what they call DBQs, disability questionnaires, which they use to determine the rating. And what the physician does, or the nurse or whoever is filling this out, is they take this form and they put in the form the various symptoms that the VA thinks most closely correspond to factors in the diagnostic code. And they use that to create a matrix that determines the percentage. And so very commonly, the VA rating folks will rely on the DBQ from the examiner to determine the rating. Now, that's not necessarily the case. They can override the rating by the examiner or reject it, as the case may be, for various reasons. But most of the time, if the compensation and pension examiner says, yes, this is service-connected, it should be rated at 20%, then the person's going to get service connection and a rating of 20%.
Now, this is another perennial complaint I hear, when people come to us as clients, and that's that their rating was unfairly low, that the rater failed to grasp the severity of the situation. What are some common causes for veterans to get these lowball ratings?
Well, probably the biggest cause is the way the system itself is set up. What happens if there is a compensation and pension exam is that the VA contracts with several different companies around the country. And those companies, in turn, hire a local nurse or physician to do compensation and pension exams. Now, they don't pay especially well for these exams, and so there's not a huge incentive for the nurse or physician that's doing them to invest a lot of time and effort in a particular exam. So they typically tend to be pretty quick, and the examiner tends not to spend a lot of time reading the veteran's file. Now, it helps if you understand that the veteran's file, even in electronic format, is often multiple thousand pages. 2,000 or 3,000 is pretty common. I've seen files that were literally 100,000 pages or more. And no examiner is going to sit down and read through page by page in those files. The VA recognizes that, and so they will typically highlight what the rater thinks may be important pieces in the file. And of course, the examiner is encouraged by the VA to read the whole file, but that's exceptionally rare. So What typically happens is the examiner will look at the pieces in the file that the VA has suggested are important. If they're really hurried, they may not even look at those, but usually they look at those, and then they do an exam and they talk to the veteran briefly. Now, if the veteran really understands the system and can explain articulately to the physician or nurse exactly what's going on, there's a better chance that the rating will be realistic. But most veterans are not familiar with the rating tables, do not understand what symptoms are important to explain, do not even understand how best to explain how this condition is actually connected to the events in the service, and will either get a rating decision back denying the claim because the medical provider didn't understand how it's connected to service and concluded it wasn't, or an unrealistically low rating because the examiner is not familiar with the patient, doesn't have time to read the whole file, and simply isn't getting the full picture. Those are the most common things.
Gotcha. And so I guess at that CMP stage, or, if it's a other examiner, what are some of the things a veteran can do to ensure they don't fall victim to those problems?
Well, probably the two most important things are to physically bring to the examiner a few key medical documents. I stress a few because, as I mentioned before, the examiner doesn't have a lot of time, doesn't have a lot of incentive to spend a lot of time, and probably won't spend a lot of time. So if you bring in a stack of documents like this, the examiner is just going to blow it off. They're not going to read through them. But if you give them a couple of pages, or 4 or 5 pages, there's a fair chance they'll look at them. And so, depending on what the condition is, it could be an MRI report showing what the recent findings have been to support the severity of the condition. It might be a couple pages from the service treatment records back when the particular veteran was in active duty service that show how the condition came about. It's often useful to take a few very helpful pages and show them to the examiner. The other thing that is important is for the veteran to understand what symptoms are important for the rating code that is applicable to their condition. So, for example, one of my favorites is the knee. You can get as many as 4 different ratings under different rating codes for one knee. And it's because the way the rating codes are set up, there's a rating for extension of the leg, there's a rating for flexion of the leg, there's a rating for instability of the leg, there's a rating, potentially a minimum compensable rating for pain in the joint. So it's important that the veteran understand what the criteria are for the particular condition that he is or she is seeking a rating for, and explain to the examiner the symptoms that are significant under that code. So it's always helpful for a veteran to discuss with an attorney or an agent or a veteran service officer who is familiar with the rating code what the symptoms are that actually show up in the rating code and need to be explained to the examiner. Those are probably the 2 biggest things: the understanding the symptoms that are important to the rating and having the key documents.
Yeah, I know in my own caseload I've seen where, especially with back conditions, things like flare-ups can be incredibly important. And, a veteran will go into a CMP exam on a good day for their back, and, the exam results find that they have a good range of motion, and et cetera, and the examiner never asks about flare-ups. The veteran doesn't volunteer any information about flare-ups, and they come out of there with maybe a 10% rating. And then when I'm discussing with the veteran, it turns out they have debilitating flare-ups, 3 or 4 times a month where they're, lying in bed because they're in so much pain. And under the rating code, it's a completely different animal.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess once the rating is set, the veteran gets their letter in the mail, opens it up, and they've got a rating they're unhappy with. What steps can they take if they disagree with that rating?
Well, there are currently, we're under a relatively new piece of legislation referred to as the AMA, the Appeals Management and Improvement Act. And although the VA seems to leave out the improvement part, but regardless, they call it the AMA. And what that does is it gives a veteran 3 options for situations where they're not happy with the rating. They can opt for what's called a higher level review. They can file a supplemental claim, or they can appeal to the Board of Veterans' Appeals. And, every fact pattern is a little different, but higher level review is the fastest, so lots of people opt for that because they're in a hurry. They want to get their benefits. Unfortunately, it's not very useful. What higher level review does is it sends the rating claim that has just been decided to a new team with a more senior rater, typically in the same office. And most of the time, the result is predictable. The senior rater looks at what the junior rater looked at and says, yep, 10%. End of story. So higher level review, in our experience, has not proven to be particularly useful in most cases. There are exceptions, but what may be more useful is a supplemental claim. Now, the way supplemental claims work, it's like higher level review. You have a year to file the claim and still keep the original effective date. And the important part about the supplemental claim is, number one, you have to file new evidence. But number two, you get to file new evidence. In higher level review, the examiner that's doing the review just looks at what was looked at before, nothing new. With the supplemental claim, however, you can submit new evidence. So you can get, for example, a statement from your own physician and submit it with the supplemental claim saying, this 10% rating is crazy. This person has severe flare-ups, using your example, and 6 or 8 days a month, he's essentially bedridden, can't do anything. 10% isn't nearly close enough to compensate him for the actual effects of this injury, and it should be much higher. The VA won't necessarily accept the opinion of your private doctor, but it will at least be in there and they may accept it. The other alternative is an appeal to the Board of Veterans' Appeals in Washington. Now, like each of these conditions, like each of these alternatives, it has good and bad points. The bad point, and let me deal with it right up front, is that it's very slow. Appeals to the board now are taking as much as 4 years, and sometimes considerable additional time after the review to get a decision. So very slow. The good news is that at the board, a team of experienced lawyers, attorneys with sometimes a high school education, are looking at the file. And so the file will get a much more careful and thorough review at the board. So if you have a good case, that's a good thing. It will also get when I say more thorough review, they'll spend a lot more time on it than the folks who made the initial rating did. So if you have good evidence and you submit it either at the supplemental claim level and it's turned down, or typically more importantly, directly to the board, you are much more likely to get a favorable result at the board than at the regional office. Good, bad, or indifferent, that's the fact. The other thing that is important about the board is you can opt to have a hearing with the board. You don't have to have a hearing, but you can. And that gives you the opportunity to actually be there in person and explain to a board judge what's going on in your case, what your symptoms are, how they're related to service, how your claim is connected to service if you've been denied service connection. That, in my opinion, is very valuable. It gives you a chance to make an actual connection with the judge. Now, the one thing, or one of the things that I least like about the new statute, the AMA, is that the judge that hears your case isn't necessarily going to be the judge that decides it. It may be, but it's not required that the judge that hears it make the determination. So hearings are not as useful, in my opinion, as they used to be in the former system, now called the legacy system, where the judge that heard the case actually was going to decide it, barring some unusual event, judge dies, judge changes jobs and goes somewhere else. Short of that, that judge would decide your case. So the overall result is you have one of these three choices. You can go higher level review, supplemental claim, or appeal to the board, and each of them have their own pros and cons.
All right. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to Victory Over VA. Please be sure to subscribe to catch our future episodes and stay up to date on the latest developments with veterans' disability.
So watch us next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.